In 1978, the Chinese government looked at a map and saw something terrifying. A wall of sand was moving toward Beijing at a rate of roughly 2 kilometers every single year. Villages were vanishing, farms were being buried alive, and nobody had any idea how to stop it. So they did something that had never been attempted anywhere on the planet. They decided to plant a forest. Not a park, not a woodland, a forest stretching over 4,000 kilometers across the northern edge of the country, from the far west of Xinjiang all the way to the coast near Heilongjiang. A living barrier designed to stand between the desert and everything the desert wanted to swallow. They called it the 3 North Shelter Belt Program. Most people outside China have never heard of it. Inside China, people call it the Great Green Wall. And over the last 47 years, workers have put more than 66 billion trees into the ground. Not million, billion. Here is the part that makes scientists uncomfortable. It did not entirely work the way anyone planned. Huge numbers of those trees died. Some regions ended up drier than before they were planted. International researchers spent decades calling the whole thing a beautiful failure, an expensive lesson in what happens when ambition outruns ecology. And then, sometime around 2015, satellite data started showing something nobody expected. The sand had stopped moving. In some places, it had actually retreated. Land that had been written off as permanently dead was growing crops again. And the researchers who had spent 20 years criticizing the program had to sit down and rewrite their conclusions. This is the story of the largest ecological engineering project in human history. How it started, how badly it went wrong, what China learned from the failure, and why the world is now watching it more closely than ever. But to understand any of it, you first have to understand what the desert was actually doing to the country. There is a mistake most people make when they picture a desert. They imagine something static, a postcard image of endless dunes sitting quietly under the sun, unchanging for thousands of years, a place that simply exists. The deserts of northern China do not sit quietly. They move. The Gobi is the 6th largest desert on Earth, and it does not stay where it is. Wind picks up loose sand and dust from the exposed surface and carries it southeast. Over years, the leading edge of the sand creeps forward, burying grassland, then farmland, then roads, then homes. Farmers in Inner Mongolia in the 1970s described waking up to find their fields half covered. Some described entire irrigation channels filled to the brim overnight. In the worst cases, villages were abandoned completely because the sand simply arrived and did not stop. By the middle of the 20th century, roughly 27% of China's entire land area was classified as desertified or at serious risk of it. That is an area larger than most countries on the planet. And the problem was accelerating, because the causes were not only natural. For decades, the grasslands of the north had been overgrazed. Sheep and goat herds grew far beyond what the land could support, and the animals stripped the vegetation down to bare soil. Once the grass roots are gone, there is nothing holding the topsoil in place. The wind takes it. What remains is sand. At the same time, forests across the north had been cut down aggressively, first for fuel, then for construction. Then, during the industrial pushes of the 1950s when timber was needed faster than it could regrow, trees that had stood for centuries came down in months. And every hillside that lost its tree cover became another place where soil could simply blow away. Then there was water. Farmers desperate to grow crops in marginal land drilled wells and pumped groundwater to the surface. It worked for a while. Then the water tables dropped. Wells that had been 10 meters deep needed to go 30, then 50. The vegetation that had survived on shallow groundwater died off, and the land dried and cracked and joined the desert. Every one of these problems fed the others. Less vegetation meant more erosion. More erosion meant less fertile soil. Less fertile soil meant harder farming, which pushed people to graze more animals and drill deeper wells, which stripped the land further. It was a spiral, and it was tightening. The results reached far beyond the countryside. Every spring, dust storms would roll off the northern deserts and slam into China's biggest cities. Beijing would wake up under a sky the color of rust. Visibility would drop to a few hundred meters. Flights were grounded, schools closed, hospitals filled with people struggling to breathe. In one particularly brutal storm, in 1993, more than 80 people died across the Northwest, and hundreds of thousands of hectares of crops were destroyed in a matter of days. And the dust did not stop at China's borders. Satellite tracking has followed these storms across the Yellow Sea to Korea and Japan, where they are known by their own names and their own dread. In extreme events, particles from the Gobi have been detected crossing the Pacific and settling over the west coast of North America. A dust storm that starts in Inner Mongolia can, in a matter of days, affect air quality in California. So when Chinese planners sat down in the late 1970s, they were not looking at an environmental inconvenience. They were looking at a slow-motion national emergency that was costing an estimated tens of billions of yuan every year in lost farmland, damaged infrastructure, and public health costs. Something drastic had to happen. What they proposed was so large that when the plan was first published internationally, several foreign scientists assumed it had been mistranslated. The idea was simple to describe and almost impossible to imagine. Build a belt of forest across the entire northern frontier of China. Make it wide enough and dense enough that wind coming off the desert would slow down before it reached farmland. Use the roots of those trees to lock the soil in place so it could not be lifted and carried. Turn a moving desert into a stationary one. The scale was the part that broke people's brains. The planned belt would eventually cover more than 4 million square kilometers, roughly 42% of China's total landmass. The timeline was set at 73 years, running from 1978 all the way to 2050. That is not a government project. That is a multi-generational commitment. The people who started it knew, with certainty, that they would not live to see it finished. The program was divided into 3 enormous phases, and each phase was broken into smaller stages with specific targets. Local governments were given quotas. Communities were mobilized. School children planted saplings on designated tree planting days. Soldiers were deployed to remote areas. In some regions, families were given plots of desert land and told that if they could green it, they could keep it. And people showed up. That is the part that gets lost in the debates about whether the project worked. Millions of ordinary people spent their weekends and their holidays walking into hostile terrain, carrying buckets of water and bundles of seedlings. There are men and women in Inner Mongolia who have spent their entire adult lives planting trees in the same 20 square kilometers of sand. Some of them started as teenagers and are now grandparents. One of the most famous is a couple from Ningxia who moved into the edge of the Ulan-Bu Desert in the 1980s with almost nothing. They dug wells by hand. They carried water on their backs across dunes. They planted, watched most of the saplings die, and planted again the next season. Over 30 years, they turned thousands of hectares of bare sand into something with roots in it. Stories like theirs are not rare. They are the actual engine of the entire program. The early strategy was straightforward. Plant fast-growing species that could establish quickly and start blocking wind within a few years. The tree of choice, overwhelmingly, was poplar. It grows fast. It grows tall. It is easy to propagate from cuttings, which meant enormous numbers could be produced cheaply. On paper, it was the perfect soldier for this war. Rows and rows of poplar went into the ground, millions upon millions of them, and for a while, it seemed to be working beautifully. The survival rates in the first few years looked acceptable. The trees grew, the wind slowed, but something was quietly going wrong underground, and it would take almost 2 decades before anyone fully understood what it was. The first serious warning came in the year 2000, in a region of Ningxia, where roughly 1 billion poplars had been planted over the preceding years. Within a short span, virtually all of them died. Not some, not most, essentially all of them. The cause was a fungal infection that swept through the plantations with terrifying speed. And the reason it spread so fast was the exact thing that had made the planting so efficient in the first place. The trees were monoculture, endless rows of the same species, often propagated from the same genetic stock, planted at uniform spacing. To a pathogen, that is not a forest. That is an all-you-can-eat buffet with no walls between the tables. Once the infection took hold in one section, there was nothing to slow it down. No genetic diversity to create resistant individuals. No mixed species to break the chain. It moved through the plantation like fire through dry paper. 1 billion trees, gone in a season. But the disease was only the most dramatic failure. The quieter one was about water, and it was arguably worse. Poplars are thirsty, extremely thirsty. A mature poplar can pull hundreds of liters of water out of the ground every single day during the growing season. In a temperate region with regular rainfall, that is fine. The rain replaces what the tree takes. In a semi-arid region on the edge of a desert, it is not fine at all. The trees did what trees do. They sent roots down looking for water, found the shallow groundwater, and drank it. And because there were tens of millions of them packed into landscapes that had never supported dense forest in the first place, they collectively drained aquifers that had taken centuries to fill. Researchers began documenting groundwater levels dropping across multiple regions of the shelter belt. In some areas, the water table fell by several meters, and then the consequences started cascading. Native grasses and shrubs that had survived on shallow moisture died off, because the trees had taken the water first. Small wetlands shrank. Streams that had run seasonally stopped running. Farmers who had drawn from shallow wells found them dry. In other words, in certain places, planting trees to fight desertification had actively accelerated desertification. The land under the plantations was drier than it had been before, and then the trees themselves began to die from it. Once the groundwater dropped below the reach of their roots, the poplars had nothing left. Entire plantations turned into what Chinese foresters started calling green deserts, and later, more bluntly, standing dead forests. Kilometers of gray, leafless trunks in perfect rows, still standing upright because there was not enough moisture in the air to rot them down. Foreign researchers who visited these sites in the 1990s and early 2000s came back with damning assessments. Papers were published arguing that the survival rate across the entire program was as low as 15%. Others suggested the trees were doing more harm than good in the driest zones. One widely cited critique argued that the whole approach was fundamentally wrong, that you cannot plant a forest where a forest never naturally existed, and that China was fighting ecology instead of working with it. There were also accusations that the numbers were inflated. Local officials had planting quotas to meet, and their careers depended on meeting them. Trees planted counted toward the target. Trees surviving 5 years later did not always get audited with the same enthusiasm. In some documented cases, the same plot of land was replanted multiple times and counted multiple times. By the mid-2000s, the international consensus on the Great Green Wall was fairly settled and fairly harsh. Impressive ambition, poor science, enormous waste. The Chinese response to all of this is the genuinely interesting part of the story, and it is the part almost nobody talks about. They did not double down. They did not bury the research. Chinese scientists were, in many cases, the ones publishing the most critical studies about their own program. Institutes within the Chinese Academy of Sciences produced work openly documenting the groundwater depletion, the monoculture vulnerability, and the poor survival rates. And starting around the early 2000s, the entire approach changed. The first change was species. The obsession with poplar ended. Planners began mixing species deliberately, combining trees, shrubs, and grasses in the same plots. Instead of importing whatever grew fastest, they started studying what had actually grown in these landscapes historically and choosing native or well-adapted species. Saxaul, a scrubby desert shrub with an extraordinary root system, became a workhorse. It looks like nothing. It is not going to appear on any postcard, but it survives on almost no water and it holds sand. The second change was even more important. Planners accepted something that sounds obvious in hindsight and was genuinely radical at the time. Not every piece of land should have trees on it. In the driest zones, the goal shifted from forest to ground cover. Grasses and low shrubs need a fraction of the water that trees do, and for the specific job of stopping sand from moving, they are often better. The roots form a dense mat close to the surface, exactly where erosion happens. Trees became a tool for specific conditions rather than the answer to everything. The third change was density. Early plantations were packed tight because tighter meant more trees planted, which meant hitting targets faster. But dense planting in a water-limited environment means every tree is competing with its neighbors for a resource that is already scarce. New guidelines dramatically reduced planting density in arid zones. Fewer trees, spaced further apart, with a much better chance of surviving to maturity. And the fourth change was measurement. Success metrics were rewritten. Instead of counting saplings put in the ground, programs began being evaluated on surviving canopy cover measured by satellite years after planting. Suddenly, there was no advantage to planting 1 million doomed seedlings. Alongside all of this came a set of engineering techniques that are, honestly, some of the most clever low-tech solutions in modern land management. The most famous is the straw checkerboard. It is exactly what it sounds like. Workers take bundles of rice or wheat straw and push them into the sand in a grid pattern, leaving the tops sticking out maybe 15 to 20 centimeters. Each square is roughly 1 meter by 1 meter. From above, a treated dune looks like an enormous chessboard laid over the landscape. The physics of it are beautiful. Wind moving across, open sand accelerates and picks up grains. The straw walls break that flow into thousands of tiny turbulent pockets, and the wind loses the energy it needs to lift sand. Within each square, the surface stabilizes. Over a few seasons, the straw decomposes and adds a small amount of organic matter to what was pure mineral sand. And in that slightly stabilized, slightly enriched square, a seed has a chance. These checkerboards were pioneered along the Baotou to Lanzhou Railway, which had been under constant threat of being buried by advancing dunes. The line had required near-constant sand clearing to stay open. After the checkerboards went in, the sand stopped arriving. The technique has since been exported and used in desert regions across Asia and Africa. Then, there is the water. Modern planting in the shelter belt increasingly uses drip irrigation, running from buried lines directly to each seedling's root zone during its first few critical years. It delivers a fraction of the water that flood irrigation would use, and it delivers it exactly where it is needed, instead of letting most of it evaporate off the surface. Once the plant is established and its roots reach deeper moisture, the drip line is retired and moved to the next section. So the question becomes, after all of that, after 47 years and 66 billion trees, and a documented catalog of failures and corrections, what does the evidence actually show? The honest answer is complicated, but it is far more positive than the critics of the 1990s expected. Start with the satellite data, because that is the hardest to argue with. Analysis of vegetation cover across northern China over the past several decades shows a clear greening trend. This is not a Chinese claim. It comes from independent satellite programs, including NASA's own observations. A widely reported NASA study on global greening found that China and India together accounted for roughly a third of the increase in green leaf area worldwide over the preceding 2 decades, despite covering a small fraction of global land area. In China's case, a large share of that came from forestry programs. Then, there is the desertification trend itself. For decades, China's desert area expanded every year. Government monitoring surveys, conducted on a 5-year cycle, showed continuous growth through the 1980s and 1990s. That trend reversed. Since the early 2000s, successive surveys have reported net contraction of desertified land, with more than 1,000 square kilometers being reclaimed annually in recent assessments. The dust storms tell the same story. Beijing in the early 2000s could expect over a dozen significant dust events in a bad spring. That number has fallen dramatically. Storms still happen, and severe ones still occur, but their frequency and their average intensity in the capital have declined substantially over the past 20 years. There are agricultural effects too. Farmland protected by shelter belts experiences slower wind at ground level, which reduces soil loss and reduces moisture evaporation from crops. Studies in protected areas of the northern plains have documented meaningful yield improvements in wheat and maize compared to unprotected land nearby, purely from wind reduction. In some regions, land that had been abandoned entirely has been brought back into production, and there is carbon. Whatever else the program has done, it has grown an enormous amount of biomass. Estimates of carbon sequestration from China's combined forestry programs run into the billions of tons over the project lifetime, making it one of the single largest deliberate carbon sinks ever created by human action. None of this means the critics were wrong. It means the criticism worked. The program that is producing these results is not the program that was launched in 1978. It is a heavily revised version, rebuilt around the failures of the original. And the failures have not all been solved. The groundwater problem is real and ongoing. In some regions of the Northwest, aquifers that supported plantations planted decades ago are still declining. Those forests are living on borrowed water, and there is a legitimate question about what happens when it runs out. Some researchers argue that certain sections of the belt are ecologically unsustainable and will eventually collapse regardless of maintenance. Maintenance itself is a massive unresolved cost. A planted forest is not a self-sustaining ecosystem, at least not for a long time. It needs thinning, replanting, pest management, and in dry zones, water. Multiply that across hundreds of millions of hectares and across generations, and you are looking at a permanent public expense that will outlive everyone currently involved. There is also a persistent question about biodiversity. A plantation is not a natural forest. Even mixed species plantations tend to have far simpler ecosystems than the grasslands they sometimes replaced. Conservation biologists have raised concerns that in certain areas, planting trees on native steppe grassland has damaged habitat for grassland specialist species. Grassland is not degraded forest. It is its own ecosystem, and it has its own species that cannot live under a tree canopy. And there remains skepticism about reporting. Independent verification of Chinese forestry statistics is difficult. Satellite greening data supports the broad direction of the claims, but the precise figures for survival rates and area covered are hard for outside researchers to audit. So the fair summary is this: the Great Green Wall is neither the triumphant success story that some coverage presents, nor the expensive failure that others insist on. It is a genuine, measurable, partial success that cost an enormous amount, wasted a significant portion of its effort, and taught the world more about ecological restoration than any project in history, largely by getting things wrong first. That last point is why the rest of the planet has started paying very close attention. Because China is not the only country with a moving desert. Across the southern edge of the Sahara, from Senegal on the Atlantic to Djibouti on the Red Sea, 11 African nations have been attempting their own Great Green Wall since 2007. The concept was borrowed directly: build a living barrier across the continent to stop the Sahara from expanding south into the Sahel, where hundreds of millions of people depend on increasingly fragile farmland. Progress there has been slow. Funding has been inconsistent. Conflict has disrupted several sections, and the initial plan suffered from exactly the same misconception China started with, that the answer was to plant a continuous line of trees. African planners have since shifted, as China did, toward a mosaic approach that combines tree planting with grassland restoration, water harvesting, and agricultural techniques that let farmers regenerate vegetation on their own land. Much of that shift was informed by studying what happened in northern China. The Chinese experience became, effectively, a 40-year full-scale field experiment that everyone else got to learn from without paying for. Chinese institutions have leaned into that, Training programs run out of desert research stations in Gansu and Ningxia now host researchers and officials from across Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East. The straw checkerboard technique has been demonstrated in Mauritania, Iran, and Mongolia. Chinese firms have taken contracts for sand stabilization along infrastructure routes in several countries. Whether you view that as generous knowledge sharing or as a form of soft power projection depends largely on your politics. It is probably both, and the two are not mutually exclusive. There is also a hard economic story underneath the environmental one, and it is worth being clear-eyed about. The shelter belt has created industries. Sand-stabilizing shrubs like saxol host a parasitic fungus that is harvested and sold as a high-value traditional medicine, and it has become a genuine income source for communities in Inner Mongolia. Sea buckthorn, planted widely for erosion control, produces berries that feed a growing juice and supplement industry. Some plantation zones now support commercial mushroom cultivation, beekeeping, and even desert tourism. That matters more than it might sound. One of the clearest lessons from decades of failed restoration projects worldwide is that trees planted for purely environmental reasons tend to get cut down or neglected within a generation. Trees that generate income for the people living beside them tend to survive. Building an economy around the forest is not a side benefit. It is arguably the only mechanism that makes a 73-year project survive its own political cycles. There has also been large-scale integration with solar power. In several desert zones, enormous photovoltaic arrays have been built directly over stabilized sand. The panels shade the ground, which reduces evaporation and lowers surface temperature enough that vegetation can establish underneath. Sheep are grazed between the rows. It is a strange sight, an industrial power plant functioning simultaneously as a nursery for desert plants, and early results suggest it works better than either use alone. Which brings us back to the beginning, and to a village somewhere in Inner Mongolia in 1978. Imagine being a farmer there. You have watched the sand take your neighbor's fields. You know it is coming for yours. And a government official arrives and tells you the plan is to plant trees, and that the project will be finished in 73 years, and that you will be dead long before then, and that your children will probably be dead too, and that your grandchildren might see the end of it. Most people, faced with that, would laugh. Some did, but enough of them picked up a shovel that 66 billion trees are now in the ground. Enough of them kept planting through the fungal outbreak that killed 1 billion poplars in a single season. Enough of them kept going through the decades when foreign scientists were publishing papers explaining that it was not working, and the sand stopped. Not everywhere, not permanently, not without an enormous ongoing cost and a long list of unresolved problems that the next generation of Chinese foresters will spend their careers arguing about. There are still standing dead forests out there. There are still aquifers dropping. There are still regions where the honest scientific answer is that we do not yet know whether this will hold. But the line on the map that had been moving toward Beijing for a century is no longer moving toward Beijing. Land that every expert had classified as permanently lost is producing food. And a technique invented by railway workers pushing straw into sand is now being used on 3 continents. The project runs until 2050. That is another 25 years of planting, monitoring, failing, and correcting. The people who will finish it have not been born yet, in the same way that the people who started it never saw a mature tree from their own first planting season. Maybe that is the actual lesson here, and it has very little to do with forestry. Almost nothing that genuinely matters can be completed inside a single human lifetime. Every serious problem facing the planet right now, the climate, the soil, the water, operates on a timescale that makes individual careers and election cycles look like rounding errors. China's answer to that was not elegant. It was clumsy, expensive, frequently wrong, and occasionally counterproductive. But it was an answer, sustained across 5 decades and multiple governments, and it produced a measurable result that satellites orbiting the Earth can see from space. The desert is still there, It will always be there. But for the first time in a very long time, it is standing still. If you found this interesting, hit subscribe. Every week we break down the massive infrastructure and engineering projects reshaping the world that barely make international news. There are more videos on screen right now if you want to keep going. And I am curious what you think. Was this worth the cost, given how much of it failed? Or should the money have gone somewhere else entirely? Let me know in the comments.